She had not spoken to anyone in weeks. The silence inside her small apartment had grown into something dense, almost physical, a weight pressing against the walls and flattening every attempt at sound. Maren moved through rooms as if trespassing, touching nothing that didn't need to be touched, avoiding corners where memories still clung like dust. Her phone lay on the kitchen counter, permanently on silent, screen face down, its battery barely alive but refusing to die completely, much like she did. Mornings no longer announced themselves. They simply arrived, grey and uninvited. Maren woke without intention, unsure whether she had slept or slipped into a numb trance that only resembled rest. Her body followed routines she no longer cared about. Lukewarm shower, hair tied without care, coffee she rarely drank. She stared at the mug until the surface cooled, then poured it down the sink. The sound of the liquid draining away was often the loudest noise of her day. The absence that filled her home had a shape. It lived in the empty chair beside the window, in the unused pile of hiking boots by the door, in the faint outline on the couch cushion where someone else once rested. She never looked directly at those places. She feared what they would show her. It had been 9 months, yet the air still remembered him, and she hated that she still did too. She left her job with a carefully worded email no one questioned. People had tried checking in at first, leaving messages full of concern and gentle nudging, but she rarely listened to them and never replied. Eventually, they stopped. Silence won. Her world had shrunk to 2 things: the apartment and the grocery store 2 blocks away. Even that trip felt monumental. She kept her head down, choosing hours when aisles were empty, avoiding the shelves that reminded her of meals once cooked for 2. She bought the same few items each time, nothing that required preparation or thought. The cashier had learned not to greet her. A nod was enough. Everything changed the day she returned from one of those quiet grocery trips and saw a cardboard sign leaning against the building's entrance. It was nothing special. A hastily drawn arrow, the words "Local Shelter Adoption Day" in red marker. She had no intention of going, no curiosity, no space for anything new. But the arrow pointed toward the small courtyard behind her building, and without understanding why, she walked toward it. The courtyard was simple: a few folding tables, a couple of volunteers, crates lined up in the shade. Most people had already come and gone. Maren intended to pass through without stopping, but one crate caught her attention, not because of movement or sound, but because of complete stillness. Inside, curled into a tight shape, was a medium-sized dog with coarse tan fur and dark, watchful eyes. He didn't bark or reach out. He didn't press his nose to the door the way others did. He simply observed her, calm and tired in a way she recognized immediately. His tag read, "Nico." A volunteer approached, speaking softly, but Maren barely processed the words. The explanation was brief. He had been found wandering near an abandoned construction site, underweight but healthy enough, skittish yet gentle. No owner had appeared. The volunteer waited for her response, but Maren offered none. She wasn't here for this. She wasn't here for anything, and yet she couldn't look away from the dog who studied her with a quiet understanding she didn't believe in anymore. There was something in his stillness that matched hers, like 2 people standing at the same edge, too exhausted to step forward or back. She walked away, but the image followed her upstairs, into the quiet of her apartment, into the night she barely slept through. The next morning, without thinking, she went back. Nico wasn't in the crate anymore. He was lying on a mat, watching the volunteers pack up, waiting without expectation. When Maren stopped in front of him, he lifted his head but did not move toward her. No pleading, just a quiet acknowledgement that she had returned. By evening, he was in her apartment. At first, she regretted it. The moment the door closed behind them, she felt panic rush to the surface. She didn't speak, not to him, not to herself, but her breaths came shallow, uneven. She wasn't ready for responsibility. She wasn't ready for another heartbeat inside her walls. But Nico didn't make demands. He walked slowly through the place, sniffing corners, pausing at doorways, as if waiting for invisible permission. He settled in the living room, curling beside the couch without climbing onto it. His presence filled the silence in a way that didn't overwhelm. It simply softened it. Their days fell into a hesitant rhythm. Maren still avoided speaking, but Nico didn't seem to require more than her quiet company. He ate without fuss, slept deeply, and stayed close without crowding her. Sometimes he followed her from room to room, pausing when she stopped, resuming when she started again. Other times he lay near the window, watching the street below, sighing softly as if he also carried something heavy he didn't know how to put down. It was the nights that unsettled her. Every evening, as soon as the sun dipped beyond the apartment buildings, Nico became restless, not anxious, just insistent. He would rise from wherever he lay, walk to the front door, and sit facing it. He didn't scratch or whine. He simply waited, pressing one paw lightly against the floor as though preparing to move. Maren ignored it at first. She was not leaving the apartment at night. She barely left during the day. But Nico repeated the same behavior every evening. He'd remain there for nearly an hour before eventually lying back down, his breathing slow but uneasy. On the seventh night, she finally broke. Not with words, but with movement. She put on a sweater she rarely wore and approached the door. Nico stood immediately. His tail stayed low, cautious, as if he was unsure she meant it. Maren opened the door just enough for him to step into the hallway. She hadn't planned on going any farther, but he turned his head toward her, waiting with the same quiet patience he had shown since the first day. She followed. They stepped into the cool night, the air crisp enough to sting. The street was almost empty, just the hum of distant traffic and the faint glow of streetlights stretching across the pavement. Nico walked slowly, not pulling, not rushing. He followed a path he seemed to know, pausing occasionally to glance back at her before continuing. It wasn't a purposeful stride, just a direction, steady and inevitable. Maren expected him to lead her around the block, maybe toward the small park she always avoided. Instead, he turned down a narrow path behind the grocery store, an area she had never used except once, long ago, when she still lived a very different life. The darkness pressed in, but Nico's calm pace kept her from turning back. When they reached the chain-link fence at the end of the path, Maren froze. Beyond it lay the road that curved toward the trailhead, the place she had sworn never to see again, the place she had spent 9 months refusing to remember. Nico stopped beside her, sitting quietly, as though the night itself needed time. Maren stared at the faint outline of the distant hills, her chest tightening. She hadn't spoken in weeks, but even if she wanted to now, she wouldn't have found a single word. She turned around abruptly and walked home before the memories surfaced. Nico followed her without hesitation. But that night, sleep refused to come, and she understood for the first time that the dog's routine wasn't random. It wasn't intentional either, just a behavior shaped by something he'd learned before she ever met him. And somehow it was pulling her back toward the one place she feared most. Maren woke the next morning with the same weight in her chest she'd carried for months, but something new pulsed beneath it, an uneasy awareness like a bruise she had pressed too hard. Nico lay curled at the foot of the bed, his breathing steady, already awake but pretending to rest. He often did that, remained still until she moved first, as though waiting for her rhythm to set the day. She rose without sound. The apartment felt colder than usual. Shadows stretched long across the floor. She made coffee she wouldn't drink and set the mug aside. Nico followed her into the kitchen, sitting just outside her reach, watching her with quiet attentiveness. She felt it again, that strange tether between them, thin but undeniable. It unnerved her. The hours passed in muted repetition. She tried to read but couldn't focus. She reorganized a drawer she didn't care about. She stood by the window longer than she meant to, watching people pass by with ease she no longer understood. Nico remained nearby, sometimes resting, sometimes pacing a short line from the window to the hallway, as though mapping the space over and over. By late afternoon, he grew restless again. It happened every day around the same time, but Maren felt the shift differently now, less like a routine and more like a reminder ticking towards something she didn't want to face. He moved to the door earlier than usual, sitting with his back straight, gaze fixed ahead. The silence in the room seemed to tighten around him. Maren tried to ignore it. She returned to the couch, pulled a blanket over her legs, stared at the blankness of the turned-off television. But Nico didn't move. His stillness held a kind of softness that made avoidance harder. He wasn't pushing, he wasn't demanding. He was simply waiting in that quiet way he had for her to choose what to do with her fear. When dusk settled, he shifted. Just a small motion, a subtle lift of his head. Maren felt something inside her tremble. She swallowed against a dry ache in her throat, stood without meaning to, and walked to the door. Nico rose immediately, tail low, ears half back, as though he understood the fragility of her steps. She put on her shoes slowly, each movement deliberate, almost ceremonial. The night air greeted her with a cold she hadn't prepared for. Nico stayed close but gave her space, matching her pace with gentle precision. They turned down the same path as before, past the quiet storefronts, past the flickering streetlight that hummed like an old memory, into the narrow corridor behind the grocery store. Every step tightened something inside Maren. She knew where Nico was leading. The trailhead lay beyond the curve of the road, hidden but too familiar. She had gone there countless times before. With him, with the life she no longer allowed herself to recall. Her breathing grew shallow. She slowed, but Nico only paused until she caught up again. He followed the edge of the fence, nose low, tail swaying slightly, a calm rhythm she did not possess. When the path opened to the bend in the road, Maren stopped completely. Her legs refused to go farther. Beyond the curve, in the faint glow of a distant street lamp, she could see the wooden sign marking the start of the trail. It was worn from years of weather, the lettering faded but still readable. She knew every inch of what lay beyond it. The winding dirt, the steep incline, the overlook where the valley opened wide beneath the sky. She shut her eyes hard, but the memories pushed forward anyway. Boots scraping gravel, laughter that rose freely, hands brushing in sunlight, breathless pauses at the summit. The last day, clouds thickening, wind shifting, his voice calling from ahead while she lagged behind, the sudden slip of rock, the sound she could never unhear. Her hands trembled. She stepped back. Nico didn't move toward the trail. Instead, he sat by her left side, lowering his head slightly, not touching her, not urging her. His presence felt like an anchor placed gently at her feet, steady but not restraining. She turned away, unable to stand there any longer. The walk back was slow, her legs unsteady, her breaths uneven. Nico followed close, his nails clicking lightly on the pavement in a rhythm that almost soothed her. Inside the apartment, she closed the door quickly, leaning her back against it as her chest tightened with something she couldn't name. That night, Maren didn't sleep. She lay awake listening to Nico shift positions on the floor, his soft sighs breaking the silence. Near dawn, she realized that his nightly insistence wasn't about the trailhead itself. It was about the path, about movement. He had come from somewhere, learned something, repeated it. Not for her, not for a purpose, but because routine is the last thing a creature holds on to when everything else is lost. Over the next days, the pattern continued. Every evening, Nico went to the door, and every evening Maren followed him outside. But only part of the way. She never reached the curve again. She stopped earlier each time, as if her body feared getting close. Nico didn't protest. He simply turned around with her, matching her retreat with patient acceptance. Still, something inside her began to shift. She found herself speaking small sounds again. Not words, but soft exhalations when Nico brushed past her, faint hums when she filled his water bowl. Not language, but beginnings of it. She ate more regularly. She opened the blinds one morning without realizing she had done it. On the 10th night, rain tapped gently across the city. Maren assumed Nico would stay calm, that the weather would break the routine. But as dusk deepened, he approached the door once more. This time, he didn't sit. He stood, looking back at her with an expression that wasn't pleading, just steady, a quiet reminder of the path he had walked again and again, long before she ever held the leash. Maren's chest tightened. Rain meant fewer people, darker streets, muddier ground. It reminded her of the day everything changed, the cold, the wet earth, the way time had stretched unbearably. She gripped the sleeve of her sweater, feeling her pulse rise. Nico remained still. She could have stayed inside. She could have pretended she didn't notice him. But she opened the door. The rain was gentle, not harsh, small droplets gathering on her eyelashes, cool against her skin. Nico stepped out first, pausing until she followed. The world felt softened by the water, sounds muted, lights blurred into halos. Maren walked with her shoulders hunched, trying to protect herself from memories that had no intention of being gentle. Nico led her along the familiar path again. But the rain changed the landscape. The grocery store's hum was quieter. The alley behind it glistened. The air smelled like wet soil and something faintly metallic. Each sensation was sharp but grounding. When they reached the beginning of the narrow corridor, Nico hesitated for the first time. He sniffed the ground, then turned his head as though considering another direction. Maren froze. She didn't know whether to be relieved or terrified by the possibility of change. But then he continued forward, steady and unhurried, following a scent or instinct she couldn't see. Maren followed, her breath short but controlled. At the curve, she stopped again. Nico didn't push. He simply sat beside her, the rain softening the shape of his fur, the two of them quiet figures beneath a grey sky. Through the curtain of falling water, the faint outline of the trail sign appeared once more. This time, she didn't turn back immediately. She stood there until the weight of the moment became too much, then retraced her steps home, Nico walking close enough to feel like a presence without becoming a crutch. Inside the apartment, she removed her wet clothes with trembling hands. Nico shook the rain from his coat and lay down near her with a slow, exhausted sigh. For the first time in months, Maren sat on the floor beside him, not touching, just near, close enough to feel the warmth of another living being, close enough to remember she still had a pulse, and though she didn't speak a single word, something inside her, something buried for 9 months, cracked open just slightly, as if preparing for whatever truth waited beyond that curve in the road. The next morning arrived quietly, a pale wash of grey over the city. Maren woke before Nico, an unusual shift in their rhythm. For a moment she didn't move, sensing the soft weight of calm pressed lightly against her chest. It wasn't comfort, just a steadiness she hadn't felt in months. Nico stirred when she stood, stretching long and slow, paws spread as if greeting the muted light. The apartment smelled faintly of rain from the night before. Her shoes were still damp by the door. Maren walked past them, placing her fingertips on the cold window pane, watching droplets slide down the glass. She felt a subtle pull inside her, something nudging her toward the idea of facing what she had avoided for so long, but the thought still frightened her. Nico ate his breakfast without fuss. He drank water, then circled twice before resting by the window. The simplicity of him, of the way he moved, the way he inhabited the world, formed a quiet contrast to the storm she carried inside. The day crawled. She tried to busy herself with things that didn't matter, reorganizing shelves, wiping down surfaces, folding already folded laundry. But each task felt thin, empty. Her thoughts returned again and again to the path behind the store, to the curve in the road, to the trail sign blurred by rain. It lingered at the edge of her mind like a shadow waiting to be named. By late afternoon, the air turned colder. The sun never fully emerged, sinking behind clouds in a muted farewell. Maren felt her heartbeat increase long before Nico began to stir. He rose from his resting place with the same gentle insistence he displayed every evening. He walked toward the door, then turned, waiting. Maren swallowed hard. Her hands trembled, but she reached for her coat. The motion felt automatic, as though some deeper part of her had already chosen. She didn't know if she was ready. She just knew she couldn't stay still anymore. Outside, the ground was still damp, but no longer slick. Nico walked slightly ahead, his steps soft on the pavement. The city felt quieter than usual, as if the world had sensed her reluctance and softened its noise in response. As they approached the narrow corridor behind the store, Maren's breath caught in her throat. The path had changed with the weather, muddy in places, scattered with small fallen leaves. Nico sniffed the ground, following the same invisible pull, and Maren followed despite the tension rising in her chest. Each step felt heavier, but she didn't stop. They reached the curve. Tonight the trail sign was clearer, the lettering more visible under the street lamp's glow. Maren stared at it, her body frozen, the cold air scraping against her lungs. She remembered the first time she had walked that trail with him. It had been spring, everything lush and green. They had climbed slowly, stopping often to look at wildflowers or birds or simply to breathe together. He had always gone ahead, calling back to her with that wide smile she still saw when she closed her eyes. She had loved how alive he felt there, how the outdoors seemed to expand something inside him. Then she remembered the last time, the wind picking up, the shift in the dirt beneath their feet, the sound of his body slipping out of reach, her scream ripping through the air, the frantic scramble down the incline, the cold shock of seeing him motionless, the endless waiting for help that came too late. Her legs began to shake, the memories flooded, unfiltered, a rush she had damned for nearly a year. She closed her eyes, but that made it worse. In the darkness she saw everything more clearly. Her breath stuttered, she took a step back, but Nico didn't move forward this time. He stepped closer, just a few inches, enough for his shoulder to hover near her leg. Not touching, not crowding, just there. His presence grounded the spinning inside her, gave shape to her breathing again. Maren opened her eyes. The trail sign remained in front of her, silent and unchanged, exactly as she had left it the day she ran away from everything that hurt too much. Her throat tightened. She couldn't go farther, but she also couldn't turn back. She stood between the two choices, unable to choose either, suspended in a moment she had feared for months. The world around her dimmed, sounds fading until only her heartbeat remained. Nico waited, patient as ever, inhaling the cool air in slow, steady breaths. After what felt like hours but could only have been minutes, Maren stepped off the main path and sat on a small patch of grass near the curve. The dampness seeped through her jeans, but she didn't move. Nico sat beside her, tail resting on the ground in a soft arc. She stared at the trail entrance, her chest tightening with a pressure that felt like crying, but didn't break through. She hadn't allowed herself that release since the day of the accident. Not once. Even at the hospital, even afterward at home, even when friends urged her to speak, she locked everything inside, fearing that once it escaped, it would consume her completely. Nico sniffed the air, then lowered his head, resting it lightly on the ground between his paws. He didn't look at her. He didn't need to. They stayed until the cold settled deep into her bones, until the sky shifted into a deeper shade of night. When she finally rose, her movements were stiff. Nico stood slowly, shaking off leaves and dirt, then followed her back without hesitation. Inside the apartment, she removed her shoes and sat on the floor beside the door. The room felt warmer than before, but her body still trembled from the weight of what she had confronted. Nico lay down next to her, not touching, but close enough to feel the heat from his fur. She stayed there until her legs went numb. Sleep came in fragments that night. Shallow, restless. She woke multiple times, staring at the ceiling, listening to Nico's breathing. Something inside her had shifted, not a release, but a crack in the wall she had built. And through that crack, memories seeped in, laughter echoing among trees, the way he held her hand on the steep parts, the warmth of his shoulder against hers at the overlook. She pressed her hands to her face, waiting for the pain to overwhelm her. But instead, she felt a strange stillness, an ache, but not destructive. A sadness she could hold without collapsing. The next evening, Nico went to the door again. Maren felt the familiar tension rise, but it didn't suffocate her this time. She put on her shoes slowly, heart pounding but steady. They walked the same path. The world felt slightly different, as though it had shifted a fraction while she wasn't looking. When they reached the curve, Maren didn't sit on the grass. She stood, breathing deeply, staring at the trail sign. Tonight she took 2 steps closer before stopping. It wasn't much, but it was the first time she had moved toward her fear instead of away from it. And Nico, sensing nothing more than her breathing slowing, settled calmly at her side, his body still and grounded beneath the subtle glow of the street lamp. The following days settled into a rhythm Maren didn't fully understand, but no longer resisted. Each evening, as if the dark carried its own quiet invitation, Nico rose from wherever he rested and moved toward the door. Not urgent, not expectant, just present. And Maren, with a tension she could feel down to her fingertips, followed him. The city felt different at night, less threatening, more open, as though its noise dimmed out of respect for the grief she carried. She walked with her shoulders hunched, hands tucked into her sleeves, her breath forming thin clouds in the cooling air. Nico stayed close, but never leaned on her. He guided by movement alone, the soft rhythm of his paws keeping time with her uneven steps. Each night they reached the curve. Each night she got a little closer. It wasn't linear. Some evenings she froze, the moment the trail sign emerged from the shadows. Other nights she reached the wooden post and stood with her hand hovering inches above it, unable to touch. The memories were sharp, unpredictable. They cut in different ways each time. The last laugh she heard from him, the echo of footsteps on gravel, the sudden drop in her stomach the moment she realized something was wrong. She carried those images like shards that shifted with every breath. But Nico's presence changed something, not through intention, but through the simple constancy of him. He waited when she stared too long. He sat when her legs trembled. He turned back the moment she did. His routines had their own logic, quiet and unassuming, and she found herself breathing in sync with that steadiness. On the 4th evening of this new pattern, she woke from a dream she hadn't had before. She and him were sitting at the overlook, the valley opening beneath them. There was no dialogue, no dramatic moment, just the faint warmth of his shoulder against hers, the feeling of his hand resting on her knee, grounding her. In the dream, he stood to take a photo, walking a few steps forward. She reached for him, then woke with her hand outstretched, lungs burning. She sat in bed for a long time. Nico lifted his head from the floor, watching her with soft eyes. She didn't speak, not even a whisper. But something about the dream settled into her chest, like a stone that belonged there. That evening, she walked faster. Her footsteps were uneven, but determined. Nico matched her without hesitation. The air was colder than previous nights, a warning of the winter approaching. Their breath mingled in front of them as they reached the curve. Maren paused only briefly before moving past the place she usually stopped. It wasn't a grand decision, just a step that didn't require thought. Nico stayed by her side, sniffing the ground, tail low and steady. The trail entrance lay ahead, the wooden sign illuminated by the beam of a street lamp. She could see the incline beginning, the dirt still damp from previous rains. The scent of pine and wet earth drifted toward her on a slow breeze, carrying a familiarity that wrapped around her like an old memory. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. She stepped forward. It felt wrong at first, like trespassing. Her shoes pressed against ground she hadn't touched since the accident. The slope rose gently, and the trees formed a quiet tunnel that swallowed the road behind her. She inhaled a breath that quivered inside her chest. Nico walked ahead, though not far, pausing every few steps as if the world itself had taught him patience. His pause left small impressions in the mud. Maren focused on them, following each one like a child, tracing footprints in the snow. She made it only a few dozen yards before her knees weakened. The trees looked too familiar. The shadows held too many shapes. She felt the memory of that day slam into her with force, the moment the trail had betrayed them, the moment her world had broken. She pressed a shaking hand against a tree trunk, grounding herself as tears stung her eyes but refused to fall. Nico stopped, turning his head slightly, ears tilted back. He stepped toward her, slow and quiet, and stopped within arm's reach. He didn't nudge her. He didn't push. He simply stood in the space she held out, a soft presence against the noise rising inside her. Maren closed her eyes, and for the first time since the accident, she let herself remember the sound of his laughter without pushing it away. It hurt, sharp and deep, but the pain didn't drown her. It sat beneath her ribs like something true, something she had been denying out of fear that acknowledging it would mean losing him again. She took a long breath, then another. When she opened her eyes, her vision steadied. She couldn't go farther, not yet. The incline ahead was too steep, the memory too heavy. But turning back didn't feel like failure this time. It felt like pausing. Nico followed her home, paws tapping softly against the pavement. Inside, Maren sat on the floor again, leaning against the wall. Nico curled nearby, one paw stretched forward as though reaching for something in a dream. She woke the next morning with a hollow ache that wasn't emptiness, but space she hadn't had in months. She moved through her apartment with slightly lighter steps. She opened a window for a few minutes, letting cold air sweep inside. She drank half a cup of coffee before the taste became too much. As evening approached, she found herself anticipating the moment Nico would move toward the door. And when he did, something inside her aligned with the motion, as though her body recognized the necessity of it. Tonight the sky carried the faintest hint of pink, the last trace of sunset slipping behind the buildings. The world felt softer, quieter. Maren walked with steadier breaths as they approached the curve. Her heartbeat still quickened, but the fear no longer felt monstrous, just familiar. She reached the trail entrance again, stepping onto the dirt with quiet resolution. She walked farther than before, past the first bend where she and him used to pause to catch their breath. The trees thickened, branches arching overhead like a canopy. The world narrowed to earth beneath her feet, and the rhythmic sound of Nico walking ahead. Then it happened. Nico paused suddenly, nose hovering above the ground. His tail lowered, his body still. Maren's chest tightened. She approached slowly, unsure what he had found. There, half buried under damp leaves, lay something small. Maren knelt down with trembling hands. She brushed away the dirt until the shape became clear, a weathered metal carabiner, scratched and rusted at the edges. She recognized it instantly. It had belonged to him. He used it to clip his water bottle to his backpack. He lost it often, laughing as he retraced his steps until he found it again. The last time she saw it was the morning of the accident. Her breath broke. A sound escaped her, a raw, fragile exhale that held months of suppressed grief. She closed her fingers around the carabiner, its cold weight pressing into her palm. She stayed like that for a long time, kneeling in the dirt while memories rose and fell like waves she could no longer hold back. Nico sat beside her, his warm presence anchoring her to the moment. He didn't move, didn't look at her. He simply remained. And in that silence, something inside Maren finally shattered, not violently but quietly, like ice thawing into water. For the first time since she lost him, she let herself cry. Not loud, not uncontrollable, just tears slipping down her face as she held the small piece of metal that reminded her of the life she had loved and feared to revisit. The trail around her remained still. The trees stood witness. Nico breathed softly, steady and grounding. She wasn't ready for what lay farther ahead on the path, but she finally understood she didn't have to walk it alone. The next morning came slowly, the kind of light that hesitates before entering a room. Maren opened her eyes to the weight of dried tears on her skin and the faint ache of a body that had finally allowed itself to break. Nico lay curled at the foot of the bed, his breathing calm, the soft thump of his tail acknowledging her first stir without demanding anything from her. She sat up and opened her hand. The carabiner rested in her palm, its metal surface cold, edges dulled by years of use and months exposed to rain and soil. She traced the familiar scratches with her thumb. A tiny groove sat on the side where he had once chipped it on a rock. She remembered that moment clearly, the way he shrugged and said it gave the piece character. She closed her fist gently around it, feeling the quiet pulse of memory, the warmth of something returned. For the first time in months, she whispered a sound, not a word, not even a breath shaped into meaning, just a soft exhale that carried recognition. Nico lifted his head, ears shifting as if attuned to the smallest fracture in her silence. He did not move toward her. He simply observed, steady and patient. Her morning passed slowly. She didn't rush her steps or try to bury her thoughts under routine. She made coffee and drank more than she had in weeks. She opened the window and let cold autumn air sweep into the apartment, brushing against curtains that hadn't moved in months. She placed the carabiner on the kitchen table, not hidden, not tucked away, in the open, where she could see it. As the day unfolded, she found herself walking through the apartment with softer movements. The empty spaces still hurt, but the pain no longer felt like a blade. It felt like something she could hold, something she could look at without collapsing. She caught herself pausing near the window seat he used to claim on slow mornings, and instead of turning away, she allowed her eyes to settle there for a moment, before moving on. Nico followed her with quiet devotion, matching her pace, never intrusive. Sometimes he rested his chin on his paws and sighed softly, a sound that filled the silence in a way that didn't overwhelm. Other times he walked a few steps behind her, as if giving her space to rediscover the rooms she had abandoned to grief. Evening approached with a sky streaked in soft violet and muted gold. The city hummed gently outside, the kind of low murmur that felt less like noise and more like presence. Maren felt her heartbeat shift as Nico stood and walked to the door, that familiar moment repeating itself but no longer tightening her chest. She reached for her coat without trembling. The air outside was crisp, carrying the scent of distant rain and fallen leaves. Nico walked at her side, his paws tapping softly against the pavement with a steadiness that reassured her more than she understood. The neighborhood lights flickered on one by one as they made their way toward the narrow corridor behind the grocery store. The path no longer felt like an accusation. It felt like a return. When they reached the curve in the road, Maren paused, not out of fear, but out of acknowledgement. This place had held her grief like a locked box, and now, as she stood facing it again, the lid no longer seemed immovable. She walked forward. Her steps onto the trail were slow, yet deliberate. each one settling deeper into the earth. Nico stayed close, not leading this time, merely accompanying. The trees greeted them with their familiar silhouettes, branches stretching overhead in a quiet arch. The world around her carried a stillness she hadn't noticed before, as if the forest itself had softened to let her through. The spot where she found the carabiner appeared sooner than expected. The leaves remained scattered, disturbed by her hands the night before. She crouched down and touched the ground gently, letting her fingers sink into the damp earth. It felt grounding, real, honest. She rose and continued walking. The incline grew steeper, the path narrowing between rocks and roots. Her breath came heavier, but not from panic, from effort, from movement she had avoided too long. Every few steps, a memory surfaced. A flash of him walking ahead, the edges of his backpack brushing the branches, the sound of his footsteps on gravel. Each memory came with an ache, but none of them knocked her off balance. They folded into her like pages of a book she had stopped reading mid-sentence. The overlook was smaller than she remembered. When she reached it, the world opened in a wide, quiet embrace, the valley stretching below, the distant lights of the city flickering like faint constellations, the horizon blurring into shades of deep blue and fading pink. Wind brushed her cheeks, cool and gentle. She stood at the spot where she and him used to rest after the climb. She could almost see him sitting cross-legged, elbows on his knees, breathing heavily and laughing at how out of shape he said he was. The memory hit hard, but instead of breaking her, it steadied her. Nico sat beside her, his body warm, a grounding presence. He didn't look at the view. He looked at her. Maren reached into her pocket and pulled out the carabiner. She held it up to the fading light, watching the metal catch the last glow of day. The weight felt different now, lighter but not diminished. She closed her hand around it, bringing it to her chest. Her breath trembled, but she remained standing. She looked out over the valley, letting the wind fill the silence between her breaths. For the first time since the accident, she allowed herself to inhabit the memory without resisting it. She let herself feel the loss fully, the shape of it, the gravity, the love that still lingered beneath the ache, and in that moment she understood that grief wasn't the enemy. It was proof of what had mattered. Nico shifted closer, his shoulder brushing lightly against her leg. Not a push, not a plea, just a quiet acknowledgement of presence. Maren lowered her hand to rest near his head, not touching him, but close enough to share the warmth. She stood there until the sky turned dark. Then she turned back toward the trail, inhaling deeply, steadying herself. Nico rose and followed, steps soft and sure. They walked down the slope together, moving with the slow, deliberate rhythm of two beings learning to breathe again. At the base of the trail, Maren paused. She looked back once, not in fear, not in pain, but in acceptance. The path no longer felt like a wound. It felt like a part of her story she could carry without drowning. She whispered a sound, softer than the breeze, almost a word, almost a release. Back in the apartment, she placed the carabiner on the windowsill, where morning light would reach it. Nico settled on the rug, curling into a peaceful shape. Maren stood in the quiet, heart heavy but steady, lungs filling with air that didn't hurt to breathe. She wasn't healed, she wasn't whole, but she was moving again. If this story touched you, consider sharing it with someone who might need it too.